Millions of tourists visit the Yucatan Peninsula every year to marvel at the ancient Maya ruins. But treating the Maya as a vanished civilization ignores a much more recent reality. In 1847, the Maya launched a highly organized 54-year military campaign against the Mexican state, swallowing entire colonial estates back into the jungle. In the 1840s, the Yucatan Peninsula was its own independent republic, heavily fractured by civil wars. A small elite class of colonizers controlled the political system, while the vast majority of the population, the Maya, faced heavy church taxes and forced labor. The tension reached a breaking point over land. As the commercial demand for sugar and agave fiber spiked, the ruling class began aggressively privatizing communal Maya territories to build highly lucrative plantations. The elites needed massive cartloads of henequen to fuel their export economy, and they relied entirely on exploited Maya labor to harvest it. To fight their internal political battles, rival factions of these elites made a fatal miscalculation. They recruited the Maya into their militias, offering military training, providing modern weapons, and promising tax exemptions in exchange for their service. When those promises were inevitably broken, the elites found themselves facing an oppressed majority that now possessed the exact combat experience and firepower required to launch a full-scale rebellion. The uprising ignited in the summer of 1847, following the execution of a prominent indigenous leader. Local Maya commanders, known as caciques, chiefs like Cecilio Chi and Jacinto Pat, mobilized their trained forces to strike back against the colonial estates. The Maya rebels executed a highly organized military strategy. They isolated colonial centers using systematic sieges, deliberately severing supply roads to cut off reinforcements and resources before launching a final advance into the town. Within months, the offensive swept the peninsula. As this map shows, by spring 1848, Maya forces controlled 90% of the Yucatan, pushing colonial elites into a tiny northwest sliver. The republic was collapsing, with the Maya armies stopping right at the borders of Mérida. But then, right as total victory over Mérida was imminent, the advancing Maya army stopped. They broke their siege lines and simply walked away from the capital. The retreat was driven by the calendar. The spring rains were arriving, and the soldiers recognized an absolute cultural imperative. It was time to plant the milpa, or corn crop. To the Maya, securing their agricultural subsistence was a higher priority than capturing the colonial capital. This temporary delay gave the terrified Yucatan government a lifeline. Facing annihilation, they sent identical letters out across the globe, desperately offering to surrender their nation's sovereignty to anyone who would rescue them. They begged the Spanish, the British, and US President James K. Polk for immediate annexation. When those empires declined, the Yucatan elites accepted a final geopolitical compromise. In August of 1848, they officially gave up their independence and rejoined the Mexican Republic, securing the federal troops, weapons, and financing needed to launch a massive counteroffensive. The Maya's deeply rooted cultural commitment to the planting season had inadvertently bought the colonizers the exact window of time they needed to summon external reinforcements and save their state. Pushed back by the Mexican military, the Maya executed a strategic retreat into the eastern jungle. There, they established a new sovereign capital called Chan Santa Cruz. In this territory, they forged a functioning indigenous nation known as the Cruzope. The state was unified by a new syncretic religion built around a prophetic oracle called the Speaking Cross, which provided spiritual authority and military cohesion to the resistance. The Cruzope state funded its military through sophisticated transnational logistics. They extracted precious timber and chicle from the jungle and traded it across the southern border to the British colony of Belize, securing a steady flow of firearms and ammunition in return. The Maya leadership also maintained a sharp awareness of global geopolitics. By tapping into newly laid international telegraph networks, they actively monitored the anti-colonial sepoy mutiny happening in India, using the news of British vulnerability halfway across the world to inform their own diplomatic strategies. A localized rebellion over taxes and land had evolved into a highly organized, independent nation-state, perfectly capable of negotiating trade and diplomacy with European empires. As the decades passed, the Maya adapted their tactics. Moving away from large-scale combat, they transitioned into a steady-state guerrilla war, melting into the dense jungle foliage to launch surprise ambushes against Mexican forces. This strategy of relentless raids successfully defended the borders of the Cruzhobe state and continually bled the Mexican military's resources, keeping the colonial forces at bay for the rest of the 19th century. But the fatal blow to the resistance didn't happen on the battlefield. In 1893, Mexico and Britain signed the Spencer-Mariscal Treaty, formally defining the border with Belize and permanently cutting off the Maya's international arms supply. Starved of ammunition, the sovereign Maya state was ultimately paralyzed by international trade agreements and border diplomacy, rather than being defeated by direct Mexican military superiority. In May of 1901, the Mexican government under President Porfirio Diaz finally ordered the army into Chan Santa Cruz. Diaz prioritized crushing the rebellion to enforce his modern state borders, and the military occupation officially ended the conflict. Yet despite the government's declaration of victory, the resistance never truly vanished. Fragmented groups of Maya fighters retreated further into the jungle, continuing their guerrilla strikes well into the 1930s. The history of the caste war highlights the Maya as a resilient, modern people who maintained their own sovereign capital for 50 years. Their ability to adapt their economy and military strategy through 5 decades of conflict ensured the survival of their cultural identity into the present day.